Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, Navigate Payment Card Industry DSS 4.0 Requirements. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key.
I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters from Moss Adams, Francis Tam, partner, and Jonathan Smith, partner. And with that, I will turn it over to Francis to get us started.
Thank you, Olivia, for the nice introduction. So welcome everybody to our webcast for PCI, Navigate through PCI Requirement 4.0. So moving on to the next one, next slide here. So many of you have heard of PCI, DSS, data security standards for many years already. If you happen to be, processing, touching credit cards, debit cards, loyalty cards, you probably heard of these because you have to comply with the PCI requirements for many years already. As you know, this has already evolved for many years, starting from 2004 or even before that when we have the mainframe days. So we have a very packed agenda within the 55, 60 minutes we have. So I don't want to delay too much about talking about history and all the stuff. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. Jonathan and I will cover a lot of these things. So without further delay, I'll give you a 30-second, hopefully maybe a minute or two, maybe not longer than that, about some of the history about PCI if you have not heard about that before. So as you can imagine, prior to the 1990s, without the proliferation of the internet, the client server environment, we're all using mainframes, and Rec Exchange is one of the first generation of payment card compliance, clearing and settlement mechanism and process in place. Without reading all the words, right, you can read it yourself and you get a slide deck. In 1999, CISP was introduced by Visa, and then 2001. Every card brand, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover, JCB, all have their own kind of program starting at that point. Fast forward to 2004. Now they say, well, as we get to use credit cards and more, there are more frauds you can see in the industry. There are more things that are happening. So they all come together and form PCI Council, SSC. So in a way, this is the history of it, right? 2006 is the version 1.1. And version 2.8 is version 1.2. It's actually October 2010, version 2.0, version 3.0. So as you can see, the progression of this, the reason why these are all kind of evolving and a new version coming out is, well, with the technology is changing these days, right? From the days of mainframe, then client server, then cloud environment, share hosting environment, you name it, right? We are seeing all these different platforms, technology stacks, and they have to evolve. And then, of course, the bad guys, the threat actors, are also changing their approach. A lot of different ways they're getting into collecting the credit card, stealing your credit card information at the point of sale system, at the server level, at before you even tokenize all these things. So with that, the council has to catch up. They have to evolve. They have to change all these requirements so that the folks like you, me, the auditors and the processors, the consumers all have to change so that we can catch up with the bad guys as well. And in May 2018 is now we get to the version we're using right now, version 3.2.1. With the, again, more proliferation of new technologies, SSL, TLS is evolving. Fast forward to mid of last year. We all got wind of this. Hey, we're going to get from version 3 to version 4.0. It's just a matter of time. When we're going to do it? Well, here we are. Mid-2021, they have solicited a lot of feedback from different entities, auditors, payment processors, you name it, acquirers, issuing banks. They want to make sure that the next generation will be very flexible and will be very customized to what we, environment is. Because there's not going to be one size fits all kind of thing, right? Before it's more like black and white. If you fail one, you fail the whole thing, and then you have to think about all kind of compensating controls. But we'll talk about a lot about that updated approach in a bit. So this is mid of last year, 2021. Version 4.0 has been released, and then there's a lot of feedback, a lot of changes keep going on and on and on. Oops. So this is back to this one here. So very quickly talk about some of the obvious, right? You probably heard of all these news in the, today news in the past. What happened if there's a breach? Very obvious, saying the obvious regulatory notification requirements. You have to notify a lot of people due to different laws and regulations, whether they're federal laws or state laws, loss of reputation, loss of customers, and potential financial liabilities. And the next slide or two will cover a little bit about, some of the information about the penalty, so to speak, that we have heard of in the past. As for you may or may not know, PCI compliance is not a federal law for now, right? There's no federal law that you must comply with PCI. However, there are a lot of state laws, depending on which states you're talking about that you're doing business in, that they make it mandatory that you have to comply with PCI compliance. So depending on what states you operate in, where you incorporate, you may want to look into it and talk to your legal counsel and make sure you comply with all these state laws. So members proven to be non-compliant. Let's say you're a acquiring bank. Let's say you are a payment processor. You have a lot of merchants. You have a lot of members that you're doing business for. Your job is to make sure these folks are compliant, and some of these things are guidance only. They're not 100% black and white for all of them. Non-compliance fine up to 500K, right? Again, there's no saying that you will be fined for up to 500K, exactly 500K. It depends on the magnitude, and a lot of times it's depending on whether you are negligent or not. They can prove it, right? So these are the things that you can see that they were rolling out some guidance about, hey, watch out. These could be all kind of be considered when it comes to penalties and fines if you have a breach. And then cost for non-compliance after a breach. This will be the same thing whether you're merchant or service provider. Again, these are all guidance only, and these are some of the things we heard in the news that we have seen cases in the past. By no means they are black and white. But we just want to point out to you, hey, if you have a breach, these could be the consequences. So you better consider preventing it from happening than actually dealing with the consequences after the breach, right? So that's obvious. So some of the dates, in the next slide, let me flash the next slide. I have put in words what you need to watch out for. But in a pictorial representation, this is what we are seeing here, right? In 2022, going from left to right, the stakeholders, we all going to get already announcement or a lot of guidance for PCI version 4.0. The draft has come out already. Official release, which happened, this month, in Q2 already, PCI version 4.0 with validation documentations. We have all kind of documentations. You will see some of the highlights Jonathan and I are going to bring out to you. By no means what we're going to cover today is 100% of everything, comprehensive list. We just basically pick some of the things that we call it low-hanging fruits, very key things, very big things. If you want to see the complete list, I highly recommend you go to one of the sources. It's no secret. You can download all these summary of changes and whatever on PCI Council website. So that's officially released. Then for QSA, ISAs like us, qualified security assessing firm like us, Jonathan, myself, and our team will go through the training for version 4.0 by June of this year. That's what they're claiming. So are there any delays? We don't know. So this year, by June, we want to go through all this training. And then after that, there will be a transition period from version 3.2.1 to 4.0 all the way to March of 2024. So as you can imagine, within this period, there will be an option for you to comply with whether you want to comply with version 3.2.1 or version 4.0. So, that will be an option, but as we will point out to you, there's a lot of work to be done for version 4.0. We highly recommend you consider switching as soon as you can and look at some of the new requirements, change the requirements in anticipation of what you may have to do in March 2024. Well, if you do it in February 2024, it may be too late, right? And then after that, there will be some new requirements that they gave us a grace period, so to speak, between March 2024 and March 2025. So these requirements will be 100% ineffective no later than March 2025. So those are the guidelines, those are the dates we were given. Any other delays or whatnot, we don't know yet, but this is right now, as of today, what we are looking at. So again, this slide will capture in writing, in words, what you need to look at. So when you get the slide deck, you may want to revisit this again. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Jonathan, to talk about one of the big things, the updated compliance approach.
Great. Thank you, Francis. Really appreciate it. So as Francis discussed, the PCI standard has been around for a while. And over the course of the past 15, 20 years or so, the standard has been really prescriptive. And this prescriptive approach dictated specific things that organizations needed to do. And over the years, these changes to the PCI standard have really been evolving and incremental in nature, where there was new technologies being accounted for, et cetera. And I'll demonstrate this here on the next screen. The updated compliance approach. So what you can see on the screen right here, this is a snapshot from the actual PCI DSS standard version 4.0. And there's a lot of familiar attributes in here. In the top left, you'll see that a lot of organizations, right, when you have a system that's commonly affected by malware, you've been implementing anti-malware solutions where you've been doing periodic scans. Well, as time has gone on, there has been additional, there's been an evolving in our anti-malware products. And we've had clients that have wanted to start using behavior analysis. Well, that hasn't been baked into the PCI standard. Well, it is now. So you can see the organizations still have the option to do periodic scans, but you can see that or right there on PCI requirement 5.4.2 that you could alternatively do continual behavior analysis. And so this idea of the prescriptive approach is kind of what we call it. The prescriptive or defined approach that you see on the screen has been around for a long time, and it still is around. With this prescriptive approach, the PCI standard tells you what to do as an organization. And you would implement these controls as prescribed here on the screen. And we as assessors, you can see on that middle column, we have the defined approach testing procedures. And so again, this pretty defined approach where you as an organization do anti-malware scans or now behavior analysis. And then we as the assessors on that middle column, we have our testing procedures dictated to us from the PCI Council. But the PCI Council's had some lessons learned. And this is illustrating of lessons learned that, hey, the PCI standard has been modified to where we can have continual behavior analysis. Well, the reality is there could be something else out there that organizations can do to meet the spirit or intent of the PCI requirement. There could be new technology introduced next year that may be awesome and great that organizations want to do. And so the PCI Council's opened up this idea of a customized approach where that allows entities to implement controls to meet requirements in a way that doesn't actually strictly follow the defined requirement. This will allow innovation and security practices and allow organizations greater flexibility in adhering to the PCI standard. To illustrate here on the screen, we're talking about anti-malware right now. So if we look at the bottom left, you can see the customized approach objective. And you can see the objective here that the PCI Council is really trying to get at is that malware cannot complete execution. So I'm just going to throw this out here for food for thought that what if you're an organization that employs some sort of allow listing software on your machines where you will only allow certain software to be run or executed on a machine? If you're doing that, could you use this customized approach to say, hey, we're going to rely on our allow listing control to satisfy the PCI requirements here, and now we don't need to do anti-malware periodic scans, behavior analysis or something. And so that flexibility is there for organizations to now take a look at what is the intent and what's that customized approach objective, and are there other things that we can be doing to keep the bad guys out, if you will. But some things to point out, and I'm going to dive through the process to go through with this customized approach, because this is new for everyone. The PCI Council has pointed out that this customized approach is really for organizations who have a lot of resources and a mature approach to risk management. And I'll demonstrate why here in the next few slides. And so what I'm showing on here is if you're going to use a customized approach in your organization, these are some of the things you have to do at a high level. The first is you have to complete a controls matrix for each control, and I will demonstrate what a controls matrix is. You have to perform a document, a targeted risk analysis, and I will also show you a targeted risk analysis example for each custom control. Then you as an organization also have to perform testing of your controls. You have to prove the effectiveness. You have to document your testing. You have to document your methods, what was tested, when was testing performed, so on and so forth. And then not only that, but you can't just set and forget these customized controls. You have to, over time, monitor and maintain evidence that shows these controls are working. And then those four bullet points that I just went over really quickly are summarized in that you have to provide all of this evidence to your assessor when it comes time for your annual assessment. And so I'm going to dive into what the controls matrix could look like and the targeted risk analysis could look like right now. And then I'll get to a little bit more what we as assessors have to do from the compliance approach. The next several slides are the summarization of a PDF document. So I'm going to go through them really quickly. I'm not going to focus a lot on them because we've got a lot of ground to cover today. But I want to illustrate something, and I'll make my point here in just a second once I kind of go through these slides really quick. But this first slide demonstrates the beginning of a PDF of a controls matrix where it starts out pretty easy. You, as an organization, need to name your customized control. You need to call out the PCI requirement, number, and objectives that you're trying to meet with this particular control. Moving on, you need to, in your controls matrix, you have to detail what is your implemented control. You have to detail where is your control implemented, when is the control going to be performed. You have to write down who has overall responsibility, accountability for controls. You need to document who is involved in managing, maintaining, and monitoring the controls. I know I'm going really fast right here. You have to, as an organization, you have to describe how your customized control actually meets the intent of the PCI DSS requirement. You have to describe your testing that you performed and the results of your testing that shows that this test or this control is effective. This last box on here, it requires your controls matrix. You need to have a summary of a whole nother table that I'll share in just a minute, this targeted risk analysis. You need to summarize the results of your targeted risk analysis within your controls matrix. And then lastly, actually not lastly, from the controls matrix template is that you have to describe how you're monitoring the effectiveness of your control over time. You're making sure that it's still in place. And so the summary is there's a good bit of information that as an organization you need to document around the customized control. And so this matrix is a template that's provided by the PCI Council that is summarized right here. And I'm going to dive into now the other, and I guess maybe to point out this controls matrix is intended to be filled out for every customized control. This isn't just one template for your entire assessment. This is a template for each control that you're going to customize. And then moving on to talk about the targeted risk analysis, it's a very similar type of topic that within this targeted risk analysis, again, it starts out pretty simple. You identify your PCI DSS requirements. You identify the objective of the requirement that you're trying to meet. And this is where it starts to get a little bit more detailed, where you can see right here, you need to, as an entity, describe the mischief that the requirement was designed to prevent. So the mischief is basically what could go wrong. And to clarify, the what could go wrong or this mischief isn't, oh, we could be breached. You know, that's just such a high level and abstract concept. If we're going to talk about the anti-malware example that I was using earlier, the mischief that you're trying to prevent is a bad person coming in and installing software and getting administrative access on a workstation, on a server that they use to then pivot into other environments, etc. And so the mischief you need to describe, it needs to be specific to the objective of the control. So moving on for more targeted risk analysis. So once again, you identify your control name identifier. You need to enumerate what part of the requirement as written will change in the proposed solution. So you have the defined approach where PCI says, oh, you need to have periodic scans. Well, in your control or in your customized control, it's going to be different. You need to enumerate that. And you need to enumerate how the proposed solution will prevent mischief. How is it going to stop the bad stuff from happening? Further, you need to describe the factors that will affect the likelihood of the mischief occurring, and you need to describe the reasons why mischief may still occur even with the application of the customized control. And then, and again, I know I'm going pretty fast here. I know we're getting a lot of questions here, and we'll take a look at the questions, and we'll do some follow-up as well. We also have to describe in the targeted risk analysis, is the mischief more or less or the same amount of likelihood to occur as if we went with the prescribed approach, the old school approach. And then you have to justify your result, your rationale from in the box 3.4. Moving on. And we're just about done with the targeted risk analysis, is that you also need to enumerate if there was some sort of unauthorized access and this access happened because you're using the customized control or customized approach, you need to enumerate, well, how many PANs being the primary account number, the credit card number, could potentially be stolen if we were to use this customized approach. And then lastly, the risk of review and approval. This is where management needs to review and agree and sign off on the customized approach for this particular requirement. And then you also have to enumerate how you're going to, once again, review this risk analysis periodically and make sure that the assumptions and the outcome of the risk analysis hasn't changed. And so I know I've thrown a lot of information at folks. The point being, and the PCI Council has actually specifically said this, I was actually consuming some information from them yesterday where they outright say, using the customized approach is not an easy effort. They're not trying to make it hard on folks, but they're certainly introducing a lot of rigor, where the intent isn't like, oh, we're going to use this customized approach to redo the entire PCI standard. Their intent is that well, maybe I should go on what their intent is, but it really seems to me that the prescribed approach is going to still be a good answer for lots of folks. And then this customized approach is going to be good for cases where we have some emerging technologies here and there, and where we really need to be analyzing, again, emerging technologies and security postures. And just to wrap up here, I'm going to point out what we have to do as assessors when an organization is using a customized approach. So when an organization is using a customized approach, when we are reviewing the customized approach, we have to review your control matrices. We have to review your targeted risk analysis. We have to review the evidence that you collected as part of your internal testing to make sure that you are doing your due diligence to make sure the control is operating effectively. And not only that, so in case you didn't catch, organizations that are implementing their own customized approach have to do their own they have to do their own testing procedures. Well, we as assessors, as you can see here in the second bullet point, we also have to do our own testing procedures to make sure that, as you can see in the third bullet point, that the requirements are meeting the customized approach objective and that the requirements are actually being shown as in place. And then lastly, there is some independence and considerations with the customized approach, because we're talking about the crafting and definition of customized approach now, or customized controls. And so as part of this, me, Jonathan Smith, as a QSA, when I'm doing an assessment of an organization, I can't be involved in the crafting of the customized controls and filling out of all the documentation, everything that we just saw just up above. But say, for example, my colleague Francis Tam, we could involve him if he's not doing the assessment work. He can assist in crafting of customized controls. And so there's some independence considerations we have to take into place there as well. And so with that being said, I know that I just threw a lot of information at folks, and I know there's going to be lots of questions. That's why we have 3 years to figure this out. And we'll try to do some Q&A here at the very end to answer some of the questions, and we'll also do some follow-up with you all as you want individually. But we're going to keep on going pretty fast through here. We have about another 30 minutes or so, and we actually want to talk about the actual changes to the PCI requirements in the prescribed approach. And so PCI standard is hundreds of pages long, and Francis and I have been doing this for a long time, and this is the biggest change in the PCI standard since it was introduced. There are a lot of changes, and so we have judgmentally moved the list down to what we'll be sharing to kind of the high impact items that Francis already talked about. What we're going to share in the next 30 minutes is not all inclusive of all the changes. The intent at the end of this meeting is not for folks to come away being, oh, our PCI 4.0 experts, we have our roadmap to figure this out. This is to start the discussion and to help you all start prioritizing, again, those high risk or high impact type items. And so with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and push it over to Francis, and we're going to start talking about the new and clarified requirements.
Yeah, so Jonathan, I think you bring up a lot of good things, right? Hopefully nobody is scared so far. As you can imagine, there are a lot of new requirements, added requirements, clarified requirements. And, on this call, we have a lot of different people, CEO, CFO, Chief Risk Officer, network engineer. So hopefully there's some takeaway for everybody. So one thing that I would want to kind of go back to what you talked about, Jonathan, is the customized approach. As you can imagine, there's a lot of negotiation room, a lot of discretionary decisions can be made between yourselves, organizations like you on the call here, as well as with your QSAs. So I think there's one comment from somebody said, hey, maybe it's easier to just implement a solution that is within the defined approach versus have to duke it out with the QSA, filling all those forms out. I'm not going to say yes or no in this call, but maybe a legitimate point about that. So having said that, what we're talking about, like Jonathan said, we pick out some of the key ones, some of the things that we want to highlight to you, and go through the spirit of this. To me, there are two things in the new version 4.0. One is a customized approach. Secondarily, I think as everybody know, before PCI examinations is of a certain point in time, the council wants people to think about for the entire period, not just in a point in time. Make this an ongoing monitoring process rather than a one-time thing. So hopefully you can keep those two things in your mind when you look at these changes. So together we're going to go through these very quickly. So the first one is requirement 1, install and maintain network security and controls. With this one, the highlighted bullet points here is something they wanted to maybe put more emphasis on the changes. Any changes, before they say, hey, they must be approved and tested. They didn't give a whole lot of guidance. Now they talk even more about, you need to look at the impact. Management needs to approve the change prior to the change, not after. And verify after the change to make sure they are, legitimate, and then you have to roll back procedures. So hopefully that will give people more guidance about what they need to do when it comes to network changes. Secondarily, 1.2.2, they say route of configuration files. As you know, that's maybe in old days, the only way that you can go in is through the firewall, and you need to look at the routers of firewalls. Now they expanded the definition to network security controls, and which is, you have to use your common sense, your logic. What does that include? Network security controls. Well, in this case, firewall rules, security groups, and a lot of other things that could affect your network security. Use your judgment, and the QSA will make sure that they keep that in mind. There are so many ingress points into your environment. What are the ones that will affect your network security? So we have to make sure that we include all of those into the consideration. 1.4, laptops used to connect to the network use, right? Now they expanded to say not only laptops, but any endpoints. What are these endpoints? Well, let's say I have a laptop, I have a workstation, I have whatever mobile devices that I'm going to connect via some untrusted network, public Wi-Fi, whatever, right? If I connect from the outside and bring it back to the company itself, how will that affect the security of these devices or the network itself? Will I introduce some kind of virus, malware, because I have connected through some of the untrusted, public Wi-Fi and bring back something to the network itself? So they want to make sure that you want to, if you have any endpoint solutions, you want to make sure you have all these solutions that, as if they were in-house, a host-based endpoint solution, protection solution would be one of them, right? Again, they have listed a few things. I'm looking at the guidance right here. They have at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8 bullet points that can give you some examples about what you want to implement if you have other endpoints, laptops, whatever, mobile devices. You want to put in the endpoint protection solutions. Over to you.
Okay, thanks. One thing I wanted to point out real quick on that last slide, if I could, I'll just go back to it real quick, is that there's timelines on there. the timelines for these changes is that these need to be in place immediately for all 4.0 assessments. And so that is March 31st of 2024. And I'm going to contrast that with the next slide that I'm going to talk about real quick, is that we have two different categories of changes here. One is the first table is a change to an existing requirement, and the next table, the last table, is these are all the straight brand new requirements. And so I'm going to talk about the brand new requirements real quick. So the first brand new requirement, requirement number 3.2.1, is the SAD, which is sensitive authentication data. That is the track, CVV, PIN data. If that is being stored prior to authorization, entities need to include that in your data retention and disposal policy procedures and processes. Basically, don't forget that you're storing that data if you're storing it before your authorization. You need to deal with it in an appropriate way, removing it after authorization, etc., and building upon that, the sensitive authentication data that is stored prior to authorization. If, once again, you're storing it prior to authorization, you need to encrypt that data. So those are new requirements. That applies to all organizations. And again, I'm talking about sensitive authentication data before authorization. I'm going to bounce back to the clarified requirements up at the top table real quick, though, because this is for issuers. So issuers are another category of organizations, and there's probably not a lot of issuers on the call. I know there's a couple, but issuers can store sensitive authentication data after authorization. They're the only group of organizations that can. And they still can with the new PCI 4.0 standards, but you can see that I've bolded that it must be encrypted post-authorization as well. And you can see that I also have those timelines in there, the 31st of March of 2025. These are ones that actually can be implemented past the 4.0 date of the 31st of March of 2024. So we really have two dates that y'all need to be watching out for, is that there are some requirements you have to adhere to immediately upon the 4.0 being in place in 2024, but then there's some that are still future dated. And then moving on with the new requirement 3.4.2, I'm calling this one a data loss prevention control. This one is where you need to implement technical controls that will prevent the copy or relocation of PAN, which is the credit card number, when using remote access technologies. So if you have an administrator who can RDP, SSH, or something into an environment where they can pull credit card numbers, implement some sort of technical mechanism that will detect and prevent that administrator from, say, maliciously copying the cardholder data. The next 3.5.1.1 is around hashing. A lot of organizations will hash credit card numbers, and that hashed credit card number typically falls out of scope for PCI, so a lot of organizations like to do that for obvious reasons, to reduce scope. But there hasn't been a lot of rigor around, well, what's the hashing algorithm? What constitutes a hash, and how do we manage the keys? This requirement is really around key management of creating those hashes. And so organizations that are hashing credit card numbers, there will be more rigor and more requirements around key management of those hashes. And then lastly, disk level and partition level encryption will only be acceptable for removable media. So there are some organizations that use disk level or partition level encryption in data centers for servers, storage area networks, etc. That's not going to really be acceptable come 31st March of 2025, as disk and partition level encryption really protects against physical theft, and there's not a lot of risk for someone pulling a forklift up and taking your data center away. So those of you organizations that are using disk and partition level encryption will need to be looking at application or file level encryption. So I'm going to bounce it over to Francis, and we're going to talk about the next topic.
Right. So one thing that I want to add to what Jonathan said is what you're seeing here, these are all the defined approach requirements, clarified or adding new ones. And then if you look at the guidance, in the official guidance, they also have a section for customized approach. So that customized approach is explaining what the spirit, what the intent of that is. If you don't have the same kind of technology stack or platform or whatever, you have to keep that intent in mind and fill out the matrix form that Jonathan was talking about with your QSA using the customized approach. So that's something we didn't cover in here, but if you look at the official one, you'll see below this, these are the defined requirements, defined approach requirements, and then below it, you will have the customized approach, spirit, intent, objective. So going to 4.1 here, so this is, if you're transporting credit card information and all the stuff. Oh, before it's only trusted keys and certificates can be accepted, should be accepted. Okay. Now they're saying that, hey, when you're using these certificates to transmit any PAN over open public network, you must be using only valid and unexpired certificates and licenses. So they make it very clear, and in the guidance I'm looking at it, hey, if you don't know how to look, you can look at, go through the certificate authority, CA, and making sure they are not expired, up-to-date certificate revocation list, CRLS, or online certificate status protocol, OCSP, to check these certificates and licenses to make sure they are still valid and making sure they are still unexpired. So those are the things that make it more stringent and a little bit more clarification. And then a new one, this is a good one that we pointed out, 4.2.1.1. You have to make sure you have always an up-to-date inventory of trusted keys and certificates to transmit PAN over open and public networks, right? That's obvious, right? You don't want to have a list of keys that are not very good, and even if you encrypt it using these keys, they may not be good enough. Okay, over to you.
Great, thanks, Francis. So we talked a little bit about this briefly. Historically speaking, the standard has allowed for, or has required, I should say, periodic antivirus scans. Well, now the prescribed approach is opening it up to where you can perform continual behavior analysis. But I also want to point out there's a subtle nuance there that you can see that in the column of 4.0 requirement summary for 5.3.2, it says perform periodic anti-malware scans and active/real-time scans. So you're doing the weekly or daily scans in addition to the active scans, or you're using something that does continual behavior analysis. Then kind of building upon that, there's some nuance with the anti-malware requirements, where anti-malware requirements historically and still currently really only are applied to components that are commonly affected by malware. So a great example is a lot of organizations judgmentally say, well, our Linux servers are not commonly affected by malware, and so we don't need to worry about installing anti-malware on these systems. Well, in the new 5.2.3.1, you as an organization need to periodically revisit that assertion and make sure that you are still, your assumptions haven't changed in terms of, if I theoretically say Linux servers don't need anti-malware, is that still the same case today as it was a year ago when we made that last decision? The next is 5.3.2.1, where organizations, they'll do the weekly scans, daily scans, etc. Really, what you need to do is just codify what your actual intervals are. Put it in your policies, procedures, that we're doing daily or weekly scans. So really define that. The next 5.3.3 is implementing a malware solution for removable electronic media. So someone pops in a flash drive onto the into a laptop or into a server or something. Does your anti-malware solution address that USB drive that just got plugged in? Would it scan it? Would it prevent files from being copied? So on and so forth. And so those are things to consider there from the removable electronic media. And then the last is 5.4.1, which is detecting and protecting against phishing attacks. This requirement is not intended to be a process improvement, if you will, of where you do training with folks. There's other PCI requirements where you do security awareness training and you can do phishing campaigns to try to teach people, etc. The intent of 5.4.1 is a technical implementation where you as an organization are actually implementing controls such as domain-based message authentication, reporting and conformance, so DMARC, or sender policy framework, SPF, domain keys identified mail, that's DKIM, or you can do link scrubbing or server-side anti-malware, etc. Again, the point of 5.4.1 is you as an organization now need to implement some actual anti-malware technical implementation controls. So I'll bounce it over to Francis now.
Yep. So for this one here, requirement number 6, especially for you if you are developing any kind of software in-house that touches credit cards, right? You may want to pay attention to this one. If you're a merchant, you don't use any of these systems that you develop in-house, maintain in-house, may not be applicable to you. So then with this one here, as in the past, if you develop any kind of software systems that touch credit cards, you have to have a vulnerability management program to make sure you have these classification, whether they're high, critical, medium, low, right? And then you have the responses, well, how do you want to make sure that you address these vulnerabilities coming out of these critical, high, or medium and low applications, right? Now they say, well, not only that, well, for example, include vulnerabilities for bespoke and custom software. So in the past, if you are only using commercially available software, then maybe you don't have to do it. Now you absolutely have to do it, even if you develop it in-house. So a lot of things that they suggest, I'm looking at some of the guidance, you have to pay attention to. For example, if you have any of these software, you have to pay attention to national certs, which stands for Computer Emergency Readiness Response Teams. Vendors, some of the bulletins, some of the newer highlights. If there are any vulnerabilities to discover, you want to address them right away, especially for the critical and high ones, right? And there's some other forums that you want to pay attention. For example, Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams first, CVSS score. All those things are very common that, especially when you're developing these software application, bespoke customer software, have a vulnerability management program to identify the risk, to identify the actions you want to take, and pay attention to some of these commercially third-party available news to make sure you address any kind of vulnerabilities. Okay, so some of the new ones that are going to be effective no later than March of 2025 at the bottom there, 6.3.2. You want to make sure you always have an inventory of all of these software you have, right? You'll be surprised some of the folks that we talk to, they don't have an inventory, so it's always a good practice to have an inventory of that. Deploy a WAF, web-based application firewall for publicly facing web applications. So before I say, well, you have to have one of the two. Either you have a WAF or use web application assessment. Now it's not an option. Controls are implemented for payment page scripts load in the customer's browser, such that each script is authorized and da-da-da. As you can imagine, this could be a high-risk one because if you have any kind of payment script to take credit cards in, the first thing some of the bad guys are going to attack would be that script. How can it change that script so that they can redirect that traffic into communicating back to them? So those are the things that you want to make sure you address before 2025. Over to you.
Thanks. So, went ahead too far. Okay, going back. Okay, so historically, organizations needed to have a matrix, just that you can see in the top left 711, where they define the access needs for each job role. So, for example, database administrator needs access to a database. Well, the PCI Council is taking this to the next level, where in the 4.0, they're requiring organizations to have an access control model, where they're really intending is for organizations to define resources that need to be protected, define the job functions that need access to the resource, and what activities each job function needs to perform. And so you can use role-based access control models, so RBAC, or attribute-based access control models, ABAC. And what you choose as an organization is going to depend upon your business and access needs. Moving on to some of the new requirements, believe it or not, the PCI standard does not really require user access reviews in the past. Well, here they are. So in 7.2.4, you as an organization need to do user access reviews every 6 months and fix any type of issues that you identified as part of the user access review. If someone has inappropriate access, scaling that back, and then getting management's acknowledgement of the review. The next is around service accounts. 7.2.5 is that you assign and manage all application service accounts. So basically, do you know what all your service accounts are that are, say, an account where System A connects to System B using an account, and is the privilege for that account appropriate? Is it too excessive? Who is responsible for the use of or management of that account? So you need to define, again, what your service accounts are and how they're being used. And then 7.2.5.1 is very similar to the first new requirement I just mentioned, which is with your service accounts, you need to periodically do a review of those and make sure that access is appropriate for your service accounts and that you're addressing any inappropriate access, and of course, getting management's review on that as well. So bounce over to Francis for the next slide.
We only have an hour, so sorry for guys for covering so much in so little time. Requirement 8. So this is very self-explanatory, I hope, right? This is talking about user access and accounts and all the stuff. So in the past, as you can see, share credentials are not allowed, no exceptions. Now they say allow an exception basis. So in a nutshell, they say if you have a business reason, for example, break the glass in case of emergency, as some of the outfits that we talk about, they do a lot of these, emergency attendants. They have to attend to the emergency needs, so they have to have a brick of glass kind of thing so that they can share. That ID could be shared by 2 or 3 people. But of course, when you share these IDs, you got to have all the mechanism in place to make sure you still maintain the traceability, accountability of who did what, and then approve all the changes if they have to make any changes. So it's spelled out in there. They are now allowing that on an exception basis. And then the next 2, right, very self-explanatory. I'm not going to read it out loud. The last one here, the passphrase must be changed every 90 days. Again, they give a new provision saying that even if you don't change it, if you do not change it, if you have a business reason why, that security posture of the accounts must be dynamically analyzed and real-time access is automatically determined. Zero trust, right? I don't know if you heard of that term. Many of you probably have. Basically, instead of like relying on a credential, relying on password, passphrase, they will dynamically, almost a real time, to analyze, hey, what is the purpose of that person accessing? What is the security posture? So again, I'm reading the guidance. They will analyze, for example, device integrity, location, access times, and the resources accessed to determine in real time whether that account can be granted access or not. So that, again, like I said before, because of the technology changes, they're giving that provision, which didn't happen before. Over to you.
Thanks. Sorry, I apologize. So service providers, so if you're an organization that connects up to your customers using a password, you need to change that password. You're connecting up to the password every 90 days. Or you do that automatically determining the security posture, the zero trust that Francis was just saying. There's not a lot of organizations out there that do that, but there are some that connect up to their customers using passwords. The next is multi-factor authentication. Is that, as multi-factor authentication requirements stated right now, that's for individuals who are getting into the Cardholder data using for administrative purposes. Well, that administrative purposes restriction is being removed, and everybody needs multi-factor authentication when accessing the Cardholder data environment. This is outside of network level, like VPN type stuff. This is when you're within an organization. If you are going within your organization from non-CDE to CDE, you got to have MFA. The next is 8.5.1 is that MFA system is not susceptible to replay attacks and can't be bypassed. So if you have a PIN that you type into your MFA, you can't use it again in the future. Or can't be bypassed that, there's an administrator that doesn't have MFA. And also moving on as far as interactive service usage, what this means is you can have service accounts. I moved on to 8.6.1. You can have service accounts where you, again, have system A communicating with system B, but if a human can log into that account, that exceptional circumstance has to be documented and the usage has to be attributed to the user. So it's allowed, but it has to be documented and again, attributed. Next is for service accounts in 8.6.2, passwords, passphrases cannot be hard-coded in scripts, configuration files, bespoke or custom source code. So don't want someone stumbling upon that in code. And then 8.6.3 is that service accounts, this is kind of a new one, may cause a little bit of consternation, is that service accounts have to be changed periodically based upon how complex the passwords are. So if you have a super long password, you may not need to change it as often, but if you have a really short service account password, you may need to change it a little bit more often. And I'll move on to the next one, which is I'm going to be talking a little bit about logging. So as we all know, the PCI standard requires daily log reviews. Well, there's some organizations that try to do a manual daily log review where they're just having human review logs. Well, that really doesn't scale well when you have, say, 1 million log entries every day. And so there's going to be a requirement now that automated mechanisms will be used to perform auto log reviews. So a Splunk, a Sumo Logic, SIM type solutions. And so and then lastly, for the logging and monitoring section right here, service providers are already doing this, and they're aware of these next 2 controls, and that is a who watches the watchers control, where when you have something like antivirus, if your antivirus solution stops working, you as an organization need to have a process in place to detect that control failure and to fix the issue, and to document what that issue is. And that requirement is now being extended to all organizations, not just service providers. So merchants, you're going to start joining the fun in the who watches the watchers controls. I'll bounce it over to Francis.
Right. So for requirement 11, this is all about testing of the systems and networks on a regular basis, right? So 11.3, they now say, before say, hey, you did a test, you addressed all the vulnerabilities, done. Now they say, no, that's not good enough. You have to make sure you retain for 12 months, any test results and the remediation efforts for at least 12 months. Why is that important? So that the folks like you have a history of it, what went wrong and how did you fix it. So this is very key for the 4.0. Number 11.3.3, and this must be corrected according to the risk assessment of the risk posed by the security issue. So I don't know if you remember the 6.3.1 that I mentioned before, where they have a vulnerability management program based on the risk, high, medium, critical. So hopefully that will be, again, addressed based on that risk assessment profile, that vulnerability management program. They want you to kind of make sure that you match up, align with your risk assessment, basically. And then the ones below that are new, right? As you can see, they are just want to try to ratchet it up so that people can take this more seriously rather than one-time thing. It's more like an ongoing process, right? You're going to read through all of them, but the two service provider ones, 11.4.7, 11.5.1.1, they are mandatory. They are making it mandatory for the service providers. If you're service providers, if you're allowing multi-tenant, you will have to support your clients that have to subject themselves to PCI examination. You will have to support them for example, external pen tests, right? You will have to kind of provide a mechanism for intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, to detect, alert, or prevent any kind of covert malware. So that's very key. And then the last one is, again, they want to make sure you have a mechanism in place to detect any kind of changing or tampering of HTTPS headers or payment scripts, payment pages, right? Because again, I think they probably see a lot of these frauds happen in the past 6 months, 12 months, 6 years, 12 years, whatever, and they all kind of go to that point to get all the card information. Over to you.
Great, thanks. So the next slide, we're talking about third-party service providers and incident response. So there's just a subtle nuance and change where historically you as organizations, if you're using the service provider, you go get the AOC from your service providers, the attestation of compliance document to show their PCI status. Well, there's some clarification now that if you are using a third-party service provider, that's the TPSP, if you're using them to help meet a requirement within your organization, within your environment, then you have to work with them on the specific PCI requirements to make sure that they are meeting the requirements on your behalf. So for example, if you're using a logging solution, there's a company that's adhering to the log, they're reviewing your logs for you and bubbling up things for you to review in your logs. You need to work with them to make sure that they are adhering to the logging requirements. The next is a clarification. I'll see this a lot of times that the PCI standard said that you need to have an incident response to be implemented in the event of a breach. Well, the council's kind of pulling back on that breach language, and they're saying, well, you need to have an incident response in the event of a suspected or confirmed security incident, because everyone has security incidents, and something they suspect, or they need to invoke the incident response plan. And it doesn't always mean that there's a breach. And so they're pulling back on the vernacular a little bit so that folks will feel a little bit more comfortable using their incident response plan and responding to it, because, it doesn't mean that you've been breached. So just softening some of the vernacular a little bit here. So the last slide here, I'll bounce over to Francis on section 12.
Great. So we're coming to a close here. This is the last requirement. Actually, I'm looking at one of the questions. So this is a very timely question that I'm looking at here. So a lot of these 4 or 5 bullet points, right? They basically want you to revisit some of the things that you decided on, that you make a decision on for every 12 months. You want to do a targeted risk assessment for PCI DSS requirements, and making sure that you and the QSA would determine how frequently you want to do that, right? Second one, 12.3.2, I think that would address one of the questions that one of the folks asked. For entities using a customized approach, you want to perform the targeted risk analysis for each PCI DSS requirement that the entity meets with the customized approach every 12 months. So if you adopt a customized approach for a certain requirement, you want to revisit it every 12 months. You cannot just say, hey, I want to do this forever, right? Maybe every 12 months, you determine, this year I want to use the customized approach, and you know what? now I'm adopting a new solution. I want to go back to the defined approach. That's fine. Okay. And then the other thing is like, hey, if you are using cryptographic cipher, and so document and making sure you document every 12 months, review hardware and software technologies, and use every 12 months. So hopefully that makes sense to you, because they want to make sure everyone look at these what we decide on every 12 months, because 12 months a lot of things can change, and then they give more guidance for the service providers if you're one of them. Every 6 months you have to make sure that what is in scope doesn't change. If you change what's in scope, you gotta expand what your coverage is for whether using the defined or customized approach, right? So that will take us to the end of all the 12 requirements. So the next steps, Jonathan and I kind of want to give you some tidbits, some of the things we think. I don't think there's any surprises here, right, Jonathan? We talked about this so many times. Go for it.
Yeah, update and understand your inventory of your card data environment. I mean, I'm just going to kind of read through these real quick. Update your risk assessment. Review the defined approach and customized approach. I mean, figure out what fits for you. And to build upon what Francis said, we had a question of, can you do a hybrid of defined and customized approach? The answer is yes. If you want to do the prescribed approach for all the requirements except for anti-malware, and anti-malware you want to do a customized approach, absolutely. But figure it out. Work with your QSA, work with your auditors, again, as early as you can. Start analyzing these things now. I mean, the PCI Council is giving folks a long runway for a reason, because some of these things may take a while to be put in place. And there, frankly, is not going to be a lot of grace. If we get to the 31st of March of 2024 or 2025 based upon the requirement, and you say, well, we're just starting the process now. That's going to be a hard discussion at that point, because right now is the time to start working on the remediation and getting things into place. And so there's going to be continual guidance coming out as PCI 4.0 continues to roll out. I mean, it's been released, but there's lots of questions the folks have, and the PCI Council continues to give guidance on. And so it's going to be a learning process over the next couple of years that we will all work on together. With that being said, we do have a couple questions. Go ahead, Francis.
Yeah, Olivia, do we have time for questions, Q&A? Oh, Emily?
Yeah, we could probably squeeze in one or two if there's some that came in that you would like to address before we wrap up.
There was a question, is this the matrix that I was showing earlier only for customized controls, or does it have to be performed for all controls? The matrix that I was showing with the controls matrix and the risk assessment matrix, those are only for customized controls. So if you want to do the prescribed approach, there's a lot less work on the audit perspective for sure.
Right. I'll take on one more. So one question is, what systems and accounts and passwords do these controls apply to? Question mark, just those in the CDE. Well, you have to kind of keep in mind, everything we talk about is primarily related to credit card information, right? That's why we use the PCI DSS as a guidance. However, having said that, you have to kind of also consider, even if they don't contain any credit card information, if they affect the effectiveness of the security and controls for the CDE of the controls in place, then they'll be in scope. So you have to kind of use your judgment. Normally, let's say I'll give you an example, right? Your GL, it may not affect the integrity of your CDE. Most likely, it will not be in scope. But if you have accounts receivable information or credit card information in your GL, then it will be in scope, or whatever connectivity it may have. So hopefully that will give you some clearance, some clarification. I'm sorry. Any other questions, we'll try to answer them through emails afterwards, and we'll make this slide deck available to the audience, right?
Yep.
Okay. Closing comments?
All right.
One last question in our last 30 seconds. One came in about, are the risk assessment required for merchants doing self-assessments? The customized approach is unfortunately not available for entities that are doing self-assessment questionnaires. You have to do a ROC, the report on compliance with the QSA, in order to do the customized approach. That's what the PCI Council has instructed us. So
we answer only 3 out of 20-something questions. So we'll try
we'll follow up with folks who ask questions, and we'll get things rounded out. So
thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Well, with that, we are right at the top of the hour here. Thank you so much, Jonathan and Francis, for a great presentation. As we've mentioned, we had a lot of questions coming in, and we are out of time. We will do our best to follow up with you via email after the webcast. And here's a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. please take a moment to complete this survey, as your feedback is very important to us. And Francis has just let me know that we will be having a part 2 of this presentation coming up sometime later this year. So hopefully you can all join us for that as well. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us again next time.
Thank you.